Welcome to today's session of 50 Plus Shades of Gothic, the Gothic across genre and media and US popular culture. Today's topic is Ecogothic and eco-horror in particular, and today's guest is Christy Tidwell. And of course, we're very happy that she's joined us here today for this interview. In terms of a quick introduction to Christy and her work, Christy is an associate professor of English and Humanities at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, and she's one of the leaders of the Ecomedia interest group at the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, and the digital strategies coordinator at the ASLE as well. She is the co-editor of a couple of edited volumes, for example, Gender and Environment in Science Fiction, which came out with Lexington Books in 2018. The forthcoming Fear and Nature Eco-Horror Studies in the Anthropocene, which is due for release in July, I think, currently, and the forthcoming special issue of Science Fiction, Film and Television on Creature Features and the Environment. Her essays have appeared in journals such as Extrapolation, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, and Gothic Nature, the most recent volume. We had the fortune of interviewing the two editors, Elizabeth and Michelle, earlier in this interview series. And she's also contributed to volumes such as Posthuman Biopolitics, the science fiction of, and sorry, I'll butcher her name, probably Joan Slonjewski, which came out with Palgrave in 2020, Fiction and the Sixth Mass Extinction, which came out with Lexington in 2019, and Creatural Fictions, which came out with Palgrave in 2016. So again, Christy, thank you for joining us here today and being ready to have this interview here in this great series of talks, if you will, or interviews on Gothic and horror.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So as I mentioned before, this interview is part of our session on eco-Gothic and eco-horror. In particular, we're hoping to talk a little bit more on eco-horror with you, since we already, as I mentioned before, had Elizabeth and Michelle talk about eco-Gothic. So I'll start this interview with a potentially simple and straightforward question, that is by asking you to define what we're actually talking about. Because as you know, the first thing that most people will probably think of when they hear eco-horror might be the typical, revenge of nature films such as Day of the Animals, Hitchcock's The Birds, and also, plant horror such as The Ruins, films in which animals and plants kind of attack humans. Is this also in line with your definition of eco-horror, or is there kind of more to it?
Yeah, that's definitely a big part of what counts as eco-horror and what people think of as eco-horror. And so that's kind of where a lot of people writing about eco-horror start, is saying, yes, there's this revenge of nature stuff. I do tend to see it as broader than that. I draw on Stephen Rust and Carter Soule's article in Isle a few years back, 2014, I think, where they lay out a broader definition that looks at eco-horror as not just revenge of nature, but also narratives about the harm that humans have done to the natural world, or that might promote ecological awareness, or that might blur lines between human and non-human. And at that point, it gets a little bit, one could say too broad, or could say capacious, right? It takes in a lot of text that wouldn't otherwise count as eco-horror. So I'm thinking about some of this might be just different ways of looking at eco-horror within other texts, things that aren't primarily horror even, but some of it is taking in horror that might not have been seen as eco-horror before, or looking for different markers for eco-horror. So there's lots of movies and novels and stories about pollution, right? And so that would be a good example of something where we see the harm done by the human world to the natural world. And that could be something like nuclear fallout and things like that. Godzilla is a great example of this, where Godzilla is a monster, sure, but I mean, we did that, right? Or things to do with climate change more currently. And this is where my examples start to blur other lines too, because I have a hard time separating science fiction from eco-horror. They're very, very related. So things like Snowpiercer or The Day After Tomorrow are science fiction films, but they also have elements of eco-horror in them. Or even things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? Which is less about nature fighting back and more about how what we've done to animals and the rest of the world kind of comes back towards us, comes back to get us, and tying to things like Carol Clover's idea of urbanoia. So yeah, I think there's so much that could count as eco-horror. And if I just start listing things, like I could go on for a while, but Rust and Soul's definition is one that I go back to over and over again, because it opens it up in some really interesting ways.
Which also ties in a certain way with a recent article that you published in the latest issue of Gothic Nature, which kind of discusses Nightmare on Elm Street as a kind of eco-horror, right? As this sort of film, if not even film series, that very much does not declare itself as eco-horror. I think you actually put it that way in the article. But it is still eco-horror because it kind of reflects on humans' interaction with the environment in a number of ways.
Yeah, and that article, I feel a little strange about it. I felt strange about it up until it was accepted and published, because I am making an argument that Nightmare on Elm Street can be read as eco-horror, even though no one ever does, right? And there's no reason to look at that and think eco-horror. But one day I found myself thinking about the title, the Elm Street, and where are the trees in this movie, right? And what kinds of trees are in this movie? And the more I dug into it, the more I found it really interesting to consider the ways that the trees are absent, right? Elm Street stands in for something larger than just the trees themselves, particularly in US culture throughout the 20th century. But I ultimately end up arguing for what I called an eco-horror of omission, right? Something that is really more about the silence about environmental harms than their presence in these texts. So I suspect that there are lots of things out there that we could look at in this kind of similar way and find things that are like just below the surface. There's this history of deforestation and planting certain kinds of trees and Dutch elm disease and how we've dealt with that or to fail to deal with that. And there's some interesting connections between that movie and its kind of Gothic sense of itself and that kind of haunting of the trees.
Right, which probably very much goes in line with who was it? I think Frederick Buell, who has this concept of the environmental unconscious, that still very much that we talk about. It might not be about the environment on the surface, but deep underneath in a certain way, there's this layer where much of what we actually talk about touches on that. And Mark Gold also has a pretty neat book upcoming on the Anthropocene unconscious, which I'll recommend in advance. I think it's only in November, but that's also upcoming. There's so much going on in that entire field in a certain way. Going back to something you sort of said before already, this sort of the sort of confrontation between humans and or the entanglements between humans and non-humans in a certain way. As we know, both horror and the Gothic, they are these sort of transgressive genres, to also draw on Fred Botting's definition of the Gothic in a certain way. So if you go back to the roots of the American Gothic, you have the Puritans going into the dangerous wilderness, where you have this kind of very foundational in a certain way for the American experience encounter with nature that is also very much becoming this confrontation with nature then. Also going back to one of your articles that you wrote, I think you're kind of a little, at the very least, a little opposed to this sort of binary thinking in terms of, human confronting nature, but rather tend to highlight the entanglements between human and nature. And could you briefly elaborate on how that plays into your scholarship in a certain way?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, that binary thinking is really, really common in eco-horror, as you're pointing out, right? So if the animals are the enemy and we're separate from them, or if the plants are the enemy and we're separate from them. And on the one hand, I do think it's worth paying attention to, right? That says something about how we see ourselves and our relationship with the natural world. And I think like Simon E. Stock's idea of ecophobia is really useful for thinking through that idea, or looking at examples like Jaws, right? Which has had real world impacts on the way people see and treat sharks. And so those responses can be actually useful for our paying attention to where our fears are and what we're doing in response to that. But I think that if we only focus on that, we're missing a lot of what's going on in eco-horror and in these texts too, because there's also all these places where we are crossing these lines between human and non-human in much more interesting ways, like to my mind. And this is where I again go back to Rest and Soul's definition. The third point that they bring up is that blurring the lines, I forget how they phrase it, between human and non-human. And sometimes that looks horrific, right? So I think about something like The Fly, right? Where, you know, Jeff Goldblum becoming Brundlefly it's not a good thing, right? Even it's blurring those lines and everything, but it doesn't turn out well. And the movie does not want us to think it's going to turn out well. But then there are other texts, like Mira Grant's Parasite series is one that I've written about, the first book of that anyway, where it's much more complicated. And the line between the parasites that get into the characters' bodies and the characters themselves are harder to see. And like the sense of like self and personhood get really fuzzy. Or I have another article that I'm just finishing up, and it's going to be out in Science Fiction, Film and Television sometime, about the film Blood Glacier, which again is, I don't know if anyone has seen this, it didn't get a ton of attention. It's about climate change and these glaciers kind of melting, and as they do, there's this kind of blood red, I think they say it's a bacteria in the film, something like that infects other beings and creates these kind of mutant hybrids, and they're supposed to be really scary. But ultimately, there's also a part of it that's about kind of embracing the mutant in it. And so it's, again, really kind of complicated and shifting our attention back towards, you know, what is our role in this and why do we think we're so special, right? So I think there's lots of places where we can see these texts as opening up lines of connection, even if ultimately a lot of the texts also want to close it down. So there's a lot of that tension that I see in eco-horror, where you get introduced to this thing. It's like, oh, maybe that would actually be cool. Maybe the monster's not so bad. Maybe I sympathize with the monster. But then the generic structure kind of requires it to be killed at the end or shut down. So Stacey Alimo writes about the kind of muddled middles of horror movies where we have that sympathy, and that's actually where the emotional response and the real work is being done. And I've been very influenced by that idea because that tends to be the way that I watch them too.
Thanks for mentioning Blood Glacier. in part because I'm Austrian, so there's that coming in. So even though the film was actually made in northern Italy, but still there's a local touch coming in there. And yeah, it's sort of what you were saying also, I would say, kind of to link it back to the other interview that I had with Kyle Bishop on zombies in a certain way. It also echoes in film, or rather video games in that case, like The Last of Us, I would argue, where you also have this sort of feeling that the infection with the parasite basically brings humans in a certain way, again, closer to nature. So you first need to bridge that gap between the human and the non-human before you really then start to embrace the kind of more than human world again in a way. Yes. So, and I think, or I would expect that your forthcoming volume that you actually co-edited with Carter Souls, whom you've mentioned before a couple of times already, will also go, or does also go in that direction. I sort of saw I think it was last week or so, 2 weeks ago, that you that PSU finally had the cover released, which looks awesome.
I'm so excited about it.
And also the lineup of authors that seems to be in there seems great. I saw that Dawn, I think, has a piece in there, and so there's a great lineup of scholars. So could you talk a little bit about maybe the entire genesis of that entire project, how you got to that, how you started working on that together with Carter Souls, and also importantly, why this volume now?
Sure. Yeah. So some of this is just because Carter and I are friends, and we go to ASLE, the Association for the Study of Literature Environment, every other year when it's up, and end up presenting together and talking about eco-horror together. And at one of those conferences, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, whatever, we're just talking, I think, with Steve Rust actually about maybe this should be our next thing. Great. It was just kind of, hanging out, having dinner, and then it became a real thing, right? Over a long period of time. So some of it was just, we thought it would be fun, right? And I really enjoyed the process of co-editing gender and environment in science fiction with Bridget Barclay. So I was up for another co-edited project. There's also just, although there is a lot of work coming out about eco-horror and the eco-Gothic, which is so great, at the point when we started this, there was less. And there hadn't been any kind of edited collection just focused on this. And still, ours will be one of the first, because there are a couple of monographs that deal with this sort of thing, and a couple of edited collections that have been really influential about more focused kind of topics, like Don Keatley's Plant Horror with Angela Tenga, and I forgot the editor's names, but the Animal Horror Cinema book, I think that's what it's called.
Yeah. Johan Höglund, Nick Hallen, and Katharina Gregersdotter.
Yeah, and it's really great. And so we saw a real opening here for us to get something out there and to present kind of our ideas about eco horror. Carter and I think, are very much on the same page, have influenced each other on how broad eco horror can be, and are really invested in looking for those places where we can bring that conversation out of even films that might not, or texts that might not be immediately obvious, because we see that a lot of value in finding that across conversations. And then more broadly, like as we say in the book, in the introduction, like we're living in eco-horrific times. This feels really like something we can't escape, is how frightening the real world news is, and then how pop culture takes up those fears in various ways.
As you were just saying, you know, how frightening the present moment in a number of ways is, I mean, you could even make the point, and I think Elizabeth and Michelle do that in the introduction to the recent Gothic nature, that, also the entire COVID pandemic now is, at the end of the day, also eco horror at times, right? Mm-hmm. And that there is also this entire dimension, of course, that this very age that we're in now, the Anthropocene, without going into detail as to what that now is, and the entire discourse surrounding that, because that would probably take hours, if not days, to disentangle. But part of that entire concept is, of course, based on the idea that humankind will be extinct at some point, along with loads of other species inhabiting the planet right now. I was wondering also, again, bridging to something that you said earlier, your interest in science fiction more so than also in addition to horror, whether that's also a sort of an avenue, if you will, or an aspect of this entire question of eco horror that then also ties the question of eco horror to your interest, your apparent interest in Jurassic Park, which I've noticed more than once. So what does Jurassic Park tell us in eco horror terms now?
Yes. Okay. So I am obsessed with Jurassic Park and the whole series, and kind of dinosaurs in pop culture generally. I'm very slowly working on something bigger about that. But I also do have a chapter out about Jurassic Park and Jurassic World in the, I'm a terrible person. I've forgotten the name of the book it's in. Anyway, it's out there.
Mass extinction.
Yes. Yes. And my argument there is kind of essentially the answer to your question. I see Jurassic Park and movies that are very much like it as addressing our fears about our own potential extinction by displacing them, right? And so this is also another place where the genre issue comes up, right? Because Jurassic Park is both science fiction and horror. It is a creature feature, which is science fiction and horror put together. And so you have these elements of the film that are very, very science fictional. It's like, what if we could do this? But then you have these elements of the film that are very horrific. It's like, oh no, what if this happened, right? So there's this tension between the kind of hopeful potential of what if we could bring back species after they're extinct? Like, what kind of hope does that give us for the sixth mass extinction that we're living through, or for ourselves in the future? But then when they come back, they turn out to be a real problem, right? We don't actually have as much control as we think we do. And so that kind of undermines a lot of that hopefulness with fear and anxiety. And I see a lot of that. Jurassic Park is so fascinating to me because it's a big studio movie and it's very polished and it seems like it should know what it's saying, but there's so much kind of conflict in these different ideas in the culture about animals and about extinction and about human control and science, that it's just this one long argument inside of itself that never quite gets resolved. And I think the role of sympathy that I've mentioned before with some of the other monsters that we see in things is really important too. Like, it's hard for me not to really sympathize with the dinosaurs when I watch Jurassic Park and all of its sequels. And I think that you see this coming through actually even more in some of the later movies, the more recent Jurassic World movies. There's a lot of room for sympathy for the dinosaurs, where we see little cute babies, where we have in the most recent, the Fallen Kingdom movie, a whole very sad scene where a Brachiosaurus dies, right? And that, I think, is a really interesting extension of that initial kind of argument that Jurassic Park puts forward. I'm not sure if that actually answered the question. I got excited.
Absolutely. And I would think it's also in a certain way interesting in a way that in Jurassic World now you have the Indominus Rex as the first time you have a creature that's, on the one hand, of course, it's really made up as this artificial creature. This is not a dinosaur. There's all of the discourse within the film that this is not a dinosaur but something else. But at the same time, it's an animal, and it's the creature that then goes on this sort of killing rampage that they make very explicit in the film, and then the next film really turns it around like 180, if not even does it 360 in a certain way. As you were saying, the complete opposite then with the Brachiosaurus in particular, where I saw tons of tweets, people tweeting that they were crying, and you were like, yes, it is. I don't know. Yes, it's of course the magic of film in a certain way, that the way that the music plays in and all of that. But yes, I can see the excitement for Jurassic Park.
The Indominus Rex is so interesting because it is set up as this like monstrous villain in the way that the like real dinosaurs, which are also made up, as they make clear in the film, aren't. But at the same time, like Indominus Rex gets kind of the Godzilla effect, where yes, it's monstrous and it's going on this rampage, but Chris Pratt's character makes the point very early on that, well, any animal would go a little insane if you kept it in a cage like this and didn't let it connect with anything.
Yes, again, the humans are at fault.
Yeah.
You mentioned now the Jurassic Park and Jurassic World as these big studio movies, but as I was saying before, you are currently also working on a book, not a book project in that case, but a special issue on creature features, which are in a certain way the opposite, because usually B movies, if not even worse than that. Then again, there's people who say that Jurassic Park is just a big budget B movie. Why the interest there? What is there any are there any different takes on human animal or human nature relations that these low budget films tell, or the messages that they convey in certain ways? Are they particularly interesting or outstanding that even scholars in the environmental humanities that don't necessarily look at horror films, let alone these B movies, might want to take a look at?
Right. Yeah. So Bridget Barclay and I, she's co-editing it with me, have been fascinated by creature features in B movies for ages. Partly they're just fun, right? I mean, if you're into that sort of thing, I guess they're not fun for everyone in the same way, but they're a place where you can really just kind of embrace a little bit of campiness and not expect everything to make sense and enjoy that. So there's that level. But that also feeds into what we think is the more serious argument here. And part of it is that distinction between B movies and studio productions, in that B movies, because they are messier in pretty much every way, their ideas and the ideologies they represent are also messier. But they're also in some ways, I think I would argue that they are more revelatory of the kind of underlying ideas in the culture. Like there's not necessarily an effort to make a big argument in a B movie. And if there is, it's pretty shallow most of the time, right? So you can see the kind of underlying assumptions and values bubbling under there. And so they reflect these cultural trends in a way that sometimes bigger studio movies have a harder time doing, because they're more intent on polishing and figuring out how they're going to make the most money with it to recoup their costs, all that kind of thing. And so looking at, for instance, 1970s environmental science fiction and eco-horror, there's so much there. And a lot of people have been writing about these movies. And each one individually may not actually be super rewarding for film analysis, some more than others. But then you get this kind of collection that shows patterns and connects to studio films and things like that. But like I'm thinking about, like I've got posters in my office that I'm looking at right now for Night of the Lepus and Frogs, which are both 1972 movies. They're not good, but they're fascinating. And they reflect a lot of the kind of contemporary anxieties and fears about pollution and the balance of nature and all these sorts of things that in the US, environmental legislation was really ramping up at that point, right? We had things leading up to it. And then at that point, there are a lot of laws being passed. And these films very directly kind of reflect that by creating these monsters, in Night of the Lepus, giant bunnies, and in Frogs, a whole variety of kind of swamp creatures that don't fit together. But then ultimately making the humans kind of the enemies. They created these problems. The bunnies are really kind of likable, right? They're still just bunnies. And you can see the same thing looking at early 21st century, like sci-fi channel movies and stuff from The Asylum. Like there are patterns there. Here, perhaps the thing that jumps out to me is the prehistoric. There's lots and lots and lots of those films that go back to, what would happen if this thing had actually just been dormant the whole time or was revived in some way. And Don Keatley is actually writing an article for that Science Fiction Film and Television special issue that deals with that. And then my essay about Blood Glacier also deals with that. And Bridget Barclay is writing about an earlier film from the 50s that kind of does something really similar. So it's a recurring sort of theme. And then I would also argue, building on Nicole Seymour's bad environmentalism, that if we don't pay attention to those kinds of films or comics or video games or silly TV shows or all the things that we don't think of as like high art or whatever, then we miss out on a lot of the conversation.
Absolutely. Since we're kind of in terms of time coming to the end already, just maybe as a final question, since you're teaching at a type of school that is not necessarily that well known here in Europe, since you're teaching at the sort of mining school essentially, maybe two questions also in part because with Jeffrey Weinstock we briefly talked about teaching the Gothic in certain ways. So what is it like to teach humanities in general and the texts that you do teach at that type of school? And more importantly, has that actually, maybe because there seems to be a pretty clear interest in the interrelations between science, technology, and popular culture, whether that has actually influenced your thinking in a certain way that is teaching at that type of school?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, so teaching humanities at a school like this one, where our students are all studying science and engineering, is quite different than my previous experience, which was at just a big state school in Texas. In part, the difference is really they don't see themselves as writers or humanities people or readers. And so some of my job is to kind of bring them on board, right? And some of them are the kind of stereotypical engineer types where they really want the answer and it needs to be logical and, you need to show me the steps. So it's a little harder to have some of the kinds of humanities conversations that you might have at different universities. The flip side of that is that they're also really happy to be taking these classes when they're required to, because it is a break from doing math and building things or whatever. And they enjoy getting into some of the stories and getting to think about these big ideas in a way that really their other classes don't ask them to. So it's an interesting experience. And I've found over time that there are some things that I would love to teach that just won't fly here, right? It's just not for them. But there are other things that I really don't have to sell them on. right? Some of the stuff I love teaching and love talking about, like Jurassic Park and Godzilla and stuff like that, they're all over that, right? And if I can connect it to that sort of thing, they're really on board. As far as the second part of the question about whether my research focus has been influenced by this, or what the kinds of things I'm paying attention to, I mean, honestly, not really. Like I was already working on feminist science fiction and feminist science studies in my dissertation before I came here. So I think maybe it's broadened my, what I would include in these conversations. But I think what's shaped what my research looks like more has actually been those connections with people at conferences. And then I come back and try teaching those things. And my students help me think through some ideas, as they always do when you're teaching things that are related to your research. But yeah, no, I think I came into this job, I think I was a good fit for this job because I was already working in that direction.
Cool, awesome. Thanks so much for this. Again, taking the time, and we all know that even, with the pandemic and everything going on, time is even more precious than usually. So we really appreciate this a lot. Are there any questions from the audience? We do have a couple of minutes. Trang is the first.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much for the fascinating talk. So you mentioned the kind of entanglements between humans and non-humans in eco-horror and eco-gothic, and how like these relationships in kind of these texts are very much complicated. And I just wonder whether you could talk a little bit more about how kind of films or literature complicate these relationships. And I have another question, but yeah, if you could kind of do that for first.
Let me think. I'm trying to think of an example that I could go to. Well, I mean, I'm going to give a pretty general answer because I'm not prepared with an example. So to back up a step, for theoretically, like I'm building on the idea of transcorporeality from Stacey Alimo, and she makes this argument that, in reality, the line between human and non-human is not an actual line. Like we're embedded in it, and it's embedded in us. And the useful thing about her idea, I think, is the recognition that this can be both harmful and helpful. Right. So some kinds of transcorporeality, some connections between us and other is damaging. Right. So thinking about, she writes about different kinds of sickness, for instance, like environmental sickness. But other kinds are helpful, where we have, organisms inside of us helping our bodies work, for instance, or even outside of our actual bodies, connections with other creatures that mean something to us and then help us perhaps see the broader world differently and act differently. So maybe to go back to Blood Glacier as my example, because it's the freshest in my mind, some of the kind of blurring of lines there is very harmful. Some characters die horribly because of these kinds of mutations that are introduced by breaching that boundary between human and non-human. But then we also get a little mutant puppy sort of thing at the end of the movie that is legitimately kind of weirdly cute and winds up creating this emotional connection between some of the human characters themselves and this mutant creature that the movie ends kind of abruptly there, so we don't get to see what would actually happen. But there is this sense that maybe this would create a different way of seeing the world and of being in the world. Does that answer your question?
No, definitely. Okay. Really interesting. It's really helpful for me as well because I'm working on that kind of area, and so it's like interesting to hear about like the theoretical views to kind of back up how do we argue, make an argument. I think the quick second question is, had you mentioned the kind of dinosaurs and Jurassic Park and all that kind of thing, and also kind of notice how eco-horror texts often kind of engage with kind of the images and figures of deep history, like Cthulhu or mythical kind of figures like in H.P. Lovecraft work. So I just wonder if you could talk a bit more about like why eco-horror kind of engaging actively with that kind of figures, kind of mythical and historical figures.
Yes. So My answer will have more to do with dinosaurs than Lovecraft, but but I think they connect. I think one of the reasons why we keep coming back to this is connected to my answer about Jurassic Park and our own fear of our own extinction. But if we think about this as in the ways in which like the Gothic is part of eco-horror, right? We have the Gothic as seeing the past kind of trailing into the present, like haunting, that sort of thing. And then we see a lot of these kind of environmental takes on that past as looking at what we'll leave behind, right? So for me, some of this is just transferring what we already know about how we learn about the prehistoric past and what's left and what's lost into trying to imagine how we might be leaving traces or be lost. So along those lines, I highly recommend David Ferrier's book, Footprints in Search of Future Fossils, because he does that kind of work, speculates forward based on the knowledge we have now about what marks will leave in this great nonfiction book. As far as the Lovecraftian element, when I've tended to think about Lovecraft in this conversation, it's been a little bit less about the time part of it and more about the cosmic sense of something bigger than us, right? And that can be time. It's just not been how I've kind of framed it in my brain, which feels to me very much like the Anthropocene itself as a concept, or like climate change, in that it is something that one person cannot do much about. And it can feel really overwhelming as a result. And it's this big process that is ongoing. And similarly, Lovecraft and the Elder Gods and all this kind of stuff is something that just completely dwarfs us, right? We can't individually do anything about that. And so it's a little bit less direct maybe than the prehistoric time, deep time sort of thing, but there's a similar logic, I think, there between the environmental issues we're looking at now and what eco-horror is doing and Lovecraft.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think that it's kind of what's happening now kind of should make a reflect on kind of our deep sort of relationship with nature that we always have, and kind of mentioning deep time and kind of just kind of talk back about what we how we are, the place that we are always in nature. But yeah, thank you very much for the answers.
Sure.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and I found the most recent Color Out of Space adaptation really interesting to think through as an eco-horror kind of film too.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry about the name, Sladja or Sladja?
It's Sladja.
Yeah, okay, the first one was right, okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you both for a great interview. And I really like, Christy, what you said about your teaching. I think it's super important not to always preach to the converted, and to talk to people who don't spend so much time thinking about the narratives that we tell each other and how they matter. And I think that we're a little bit in this mess because we didn't do that enough. So
yeah.
I have a question about I think mutant puppies.
Okay.
About this sense that there is more and more narratives where we're embracing the mutant, and in this way think about our role in this. So sympathy for the predator that is dinosaur, and why is the dinosaur a predator, etc. It's something also that I'm asking myself, so I don't even know if it's possible to answer, but I just want to ask this because I ask myself, is that social activism or not? Because most of these narratives do return to an original order, and I almost, the more and more I look into it, I'm growing frustrated because I think, oh, so we're kind of just like, we have all of this where we can feel a little bit better, and then we go back to the initial situation. That seems highly problematic? Do you share this fear, or I don't know?
Yes.
More of an openness towards a change.
Yeah, I do share that fear and that anxiety, and that's something we tried to address a little bit in the introduction to Fear of Nature, to our eco-horror book, because yeah, eco-horror is not activism, right? It's not actually doing anything. And looking at, say, Jurassic Park, like the sympathy for the dinosaurs, like, yeah, that's all well and good, but when the movie's over, like it kind of has this sort of comforting effect of now you can go back to your life and not have to worry about this anymore. I do want to believe, although I have no evidence for this at this point, that these kinds of patterns that I was talking about not only reflect the anxieties we have, but could have an impact on what we think is normal, and that would then impact. So it's a long game, right? Where I think that if we have enough stories asking us to think differently about our relationship to the non-human, that over time those add up to something. But any one movie, it's hard for me to see that as making that big of a difference.
No, certainly not one movie, but I'm thinking in comparison to, let's say, the 1950s, where plant horror was a big topic, and there is all kinds of monster cinematography that grew out of an anxiety about about the current world order and about okay, let's just say pressing fears, but and currently we have environmental problems, so thus this is the topic of horror films. But do we really tell these stories differently than we did in the 1950s or 60s or 70s? It was different fears back then, but that's kind of, yeah, I don't. Yeah, like I said, it's maybe too large and too question, maybe just something to think about.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question, and I think part of where I've wound up for right now is kind of what I already said, and thinking that, you know, there's some hope here for some change, but maybe not like incremental. I think teaching is where you're more likely to have a change than making these movies, honestly, in some ways. But yeah, no, I really want to believe in that sort of thing. And there are some people I know who are doing research, empirical research into what kinds of impact these films might have, like Matthew Schneider, Meyerson, and Alexa Weik von Mosner, and people like that who are doing some really cool things. And I hope we'll find more useful evidence of what makes a difference or what does not, in helping people think through these things and actually change patterns of behavior.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anna was next.
Hi again.
Hello.
I was when you were talking about Jurassic Park, it came to my mind a movie such as Splice can be. You know, constructing a being for our own benefit, and then it gets out of hand. And also that movie, to me, I think it tells about humans projecting their own needs, issues, and emotions on non-humans. So I was thinking, aside from this sympathetic, empathetic, cute sense of that we were just commenting about, do you think that these projections, so assuming non-humans in human terms, does it contribute to the horror?
Maybe. I have to think about that. I mean, one way to kind of think about that, I think Splice is a great connection to make too, because it's a Frankenstein story, and so is Jurassic Park, right? So we're really going all the way back to Frankenstein with a lot of that sort of thing, where it's the same kind of tension between, are we sympathetic to the creature, but also he's horrifying, and who's the real monster here? All those kinds of questions have a long history in science fiction and the Gothic and horror. I'm not actually sure how to answer your question. I'm trying to think of an example, because I think some of what's going on, just to stick with my Jurassic Park example, because it's right there. There are moments where the film asks us to see humans and the dinosaurs as very, very similar. but I'm not sure if that's horrific in those moments or not. Some of it may be, like the moment when the great white hunter, whose name I always forget, is killed by the velociraptors, right? That clever girl, right? That it's kind of horrific that they're clever, right? The velociraptors are very scary because they can open doors and stuff. But then there's other moments, like I always see the T-Rex at the end as very like a human triumph sort of thing, like celebratory, like standing up and roaring, and this is my island now kind of moment. And they keep coming back to that. And that doesn't seem horrific to me. Like in the movie, it doesn't seem to present it that way because the music is very like triumphal, right? So I guess it depends on which kind of instance. Like it seems like a lot of movies probably want to have it both ways.
Yeah, man, maybe, I don't know. I really like narratives where there is this projection and then there's a twist, like the creature or whatever the humans are projecting onto, at the end does not behave as we assumed,
Right.
Maybe it's not a good example, but the girl with all the gifts, that at the end she does what she wants, because we are the new species, so she doesn't do what the humans expected her to do. And I think that's scary in a way, to think that we assume something that it's going to behave as humans, but then it does not.
Yeah. And I think that points to one of the things that keeps coming up in my writing, which is control. Like human control, human expectation of control. We really want to be in charge. And we want, as you're saying, the rest of the world to do what we expect it to do, but it keeps not doing that. And I think you're right. That's where a lot of the horror comes from. So yeah, I was thinking about what ways they seem like more human, but in what ways do they behave as expected when they don't? Yeah, that is frequently set up as horrifying for the human audience, right? Because it undermines our sense of ourselves as kind of the pinnacle of everything and the end point of evolution and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
I was thinking of Orca during your discussion, not necessarily both the film, but actually more so I think the novel, if memory serves, if I remember right, because I'm thinking that the novel ends in this sort of way that the orca does not necessarily act the way that humans would, because that the film very much has this total revenge thing throughout, where the orca very much becomes the projection of the whatever the guy's name is, but the novel is a bit more complex, I think. But
yeah, I haven't read it. I have it at home.
I could be misremembering. It's been a while. We had one more question. Alyssa wanted to ask something.
Hi. Great talk. I love every single text that you talked about. So it's kind of like my own personal bingo card here while I was listening. It's like Jurassic Park and Mira Grant and B movies. And for the people who are kind of talking about aquatic horror as well, Grant's Into the Drowning Deep is one of my all-time favorites. But what I specifically wanted to kind of ask about is the B movie aspect of it, because I have a chapter coming out that I co-authored, and I worked together with a biologist. And we actually taught a course, team taught a course on the biology of monster movies and the biology of like B movies, and what we ended up writing about was sci-fi movies, specifically sci-fi original films and all that ridiculousness. And I'm kind of wondering from your perspective, with so much more experience writing about these topics and these films, like, is that a productive avenue? Like the biologist I worked with is a very special biologist. He's a lot more fun than a bunch of the other scientists who would kind of go, no, I'm not going to do that. But kind of from your experience, both where you teach and with your own research, and going back to that question of like, how can we make a difference? Like, is that maybe one way?
You mean like teaching the actual science behind it, that part of it, or getting science students to think about these things, or which part do you mean?
I think any of it.
Okay.
Like the approach we took in our class was we would watch the films and I would talk about like the cultural studies horror stuff, and then he would give them research questions, and they would have to go like actually do secondary research into those questions about like how feasible the different things were. And so a lot of them were science students because it was a technical college, but a lot of them were also taking it as a gen ed. And so then they were just gaining research skills and also kind of that scientific literacy, but also like the fun stuff, the stuff that we like.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of it depends on what you mean by productive, right? So in terms of getting students to think critically about what they're taking in and to do that kind of research, that sounds like a fun way to do that, right? And I'd be curious to know how the students responded to it. As far as some of the bigger questions about, what kind of social difference might this make? That's always hard to answer. I guess one thing I'm thinking about is whether in B movies it matters if the science is right, like, and if it matters, why it matters, right? I don't have an answer to this, but like my approach to B movies has very much been like, it doesn't matter, like just do what you're doing, and as long as you've decided what you're doing, we're good. So maybe the bigger question is about how people watch them, right? So if other people are watching them in the way that I do, where it's like, I know that's not real, it's fine, whatever, or I don't expect it to be real. But if people are watching the movies and thinking, hey, is that how science works? Then addressing that would be important, right?
Okay, cool, thank you.
Anna already asked the question in the chat, but any final questions? Does not seem to be the case, despite the awesome texts that you talked about and the entertaining texts. And also culturally relevant, of course. We need to stress that. Again, thanks, Christy, for joining us here today. Great interview. And I'm really looking forward to the edited volume later this year.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, keep an eye out for that. I'll be posting about it on my social media as it gets closer.
Okay, Anna, you take the lead again.
Maybe we can, whoever in the public wants it, turn on their cameras so we can just see our faces. And thank you for this very, very interesting talk. It was very nice. Thanks to the public as well, as the questions were very interesting as well. And we will see some of you again, either in your panel or in the last keynote we have left to record. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.